If you're on YouTube, then it's safe to assume that you know what Harry Potter is. It was hugely important to people in my generation, so you know what that means. At some point, Warner Brothers looked over at all this bank Scholastic was raking in and decided they wanted in on this weird wizard pie. They would go on to produce a hugely influential film series based off the books, and each would receive several video game adaptations for the various consoles of the time. Today, I want to take you through all of them. The book, the film, and video games for the first Harry Potter adventure. Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Why? I don't know, I just wanted to play a bunch of Harry Potter games, I guess. I think Rowling in general is a decent writer. She has a real knack for describing character and is excellent at expressing the fantastical nature of the places in the wizarding world. The Potter books are all mysteries at their core, with this first book being centered around not only the question of what is in the third floor corridor, but also Harry's general discovery of his powers and learning about the underground wizard society. I think it is successful both as a starting point and as a story in its own right. Taken in a vacuum, it is apparent why this series took off in the way that it did. However, this being Rowling's first published work and focusing on children as the primary demographic, this book certainly has a lot of rough edges. If her style has one fatal flaw, it is her excessive use of adjectives. You just have to know how merrily she walked, and how flatulently this man spoke, and how haughtily Zumacrum skedaddled from the hot flames of Hermione's wand sparks.
They're all pissed for Snake.
There are some things in the wizarding world that just don't hold up to scrutiny if you think about them too hard. I know the big boys of this platform have ruined media criticism forever with incessant nitpicks, but some of these things really just bother me. I guess it just reeks of poorly thought out world building for the sake of a mood that was already being pretty well established, and wait a second. Pick your favorite tune and sing along. This is such a strange film to talk about because it's hard to separate it from its legacy and evaluate it as an individual film, even more so than the books. It is full of questionable decisions both as an adaptation and as a standalone product, even if one considers its ambitions as the start of a 7-part series. Before I get into its failings, however, I want to point out two aspects where I think the film excels. Firstly, the score is wonderful. The series would see several different composers over the years, but the core sound developed by the impeccable John Williams in these first 3 films is just perfect. Everything from the bombastic fantasy fanfare, to the wispy and mysterious string solos, the whole composition oozes atmosphere and complements the wizarding world fantastically. Oh no, I looked away, I know I'm lost. Secondly, the casting is overall excellent. There are a few duds. I'm not a huge fan of Richard Harris's Dumbledore. Silence! And the children actors are children actors.
Shut up!
The rest of the cast, however, fulfill their role wonderfully even in this early stage. Actors with long, recognizable careers before these films, like Alan Rickman or Maggie Smith, put in such iconic performances here that their legacy amongst an entire generation will always be found in the Harry Potter films. Now let's transition from the good to the bad by talking about something this film does abysmally: the CGI. Now, I know it's not entirely fair to criticize attempts at photorealistic computer images from 2001 with my shiny, raycasted 2019 eyeballs, but boy howdy, aged poorly doesn't even begin to describe some of these scenes. A lot of it, I think, was done so as to not put these dopey little kids in too much danger, but considering the effort and expense animating a realistic human child represents, I feel like they could have constructed an adequately safe green screen rig for the same price. I don't think it was all that revolutionary when Peter Jackson's crew tied some little people to sticks and waved them around in front of the Disappearo panel. And we know they have the technology. Put the part with the invisibility cloak where you can see the green one. Yeah, you fucking know, you're me in the future. You know this. It's just strange to me that they would, for example, do the Lumos spell effects practically, but not a scene as complicated as this one with Neville. Something else that drags the film down is the editing, which feels really off a lot of the time. Often it'll linger on a scene for just a second too long, usually to the detriment of the actors. Maybe I wouldn't be as bothered by the dated CGI if the film didn't feel the need to hesitate anytime it was on screen. In any case, I think it's still an entertaining movie on its own, but it's not exactly a masterwork. Nothing in the Harry Potter series is. Before we get into this properly, I need to talk about compatibility issues. This game was made for the Unreal Engine circa 2001, and we've been through roughly negative 19,000 Windows updates since then. This means, of course, that getting this game to run on modern hardware was a huge pain. You'll probably notice this watermark all over the footage, and that was because I had to download some special driver to get it to run at all, and even then it's clearly not doing what it's supposed to. I can't tell which glitches are inherent to the software and which were being introduced by all this, but honestly, I think it ended up improving my experience anyway. For example, because the game is running slightly too fast, the trigger for the next line of dialogue to start happens before the previous one ends.
And stumbled, but alas, when I returned, they'd been replaced by and now, up the stairs and off to your lessons. Don't be late.
Why did Dumbledore age 50 years between these two lines? The gameplay is a very rudimentary Zelda-like puzzle platformer. Remember how some of the puzzles in Ocarina of Time worked? Where you would look around a room and find an eyeball to shoot, and that was it? Yeah, do that 30 times in a row with auto-aim enabled, and that's every level of this game. The platforming is just as bare bones, mostly consisting of waiting around on moving platforms or magnetizing to the edges of weird square pillars. Though that may be a blessing, seeing as Harry controls like a tank, and you have no choice but to use the keyboard. Besides, how can we call this a 3D platformer if there wasn't some obnoxious collectible all over the place?
30 bots every flavour. We're collecting them too. We need 25 beans, Harry. Come back, come see us, and we'll show you the way to class.
This has a pretty good payoff at the end though, so I can't get too upset. Anyway, after being tutorialized at for a while, you get to play this Mario Party minigame to learn the most important spell ever to be made. Flipendo! The incantation is never outright said in the books as far as I'm aware, but they do mention a knockback jinx sometimes, and it seems to function in the same way. It's a staple of the early Harry Potter games for some reason, and we'll be seeing it a lot from now on.
Here, catch.
Hey, is anyone gonna tell Malfoy to knock it off? He's trying to blow up another student in the middle of the main entrance hall. Fucking, this building's made of stone. Every teacher can hear this. They also perfectly adapted Quidditch to the game, in that it's a bunch of players meandering around doing nothing of importance while the Seekers glitch themselves around the snitch. For some reason, I completely got stuck on this part because the game refused to let me climb on this ledge. I ended up having to resort to one of the built-in cheats to pass it. Hilariously, you activate it by typing the word Harry Super Jump into the keyboard, in the middle of regular gameplay. Also, because the letter A appears in the word, you have to make sure to angle yourself slightly more to the right than you need to be, otherwise you'll fly off in the wrong direction. It's almost as if they didn't intend regular players to use this feature.
Harry! A huge troll is on the rampage! She needs our help! We must try to rescue her straight away!
Yeah, okay, Ron, I gotta check.
The armor might have beams in them.
So after beating this terrible boss fight against Fluffy, getting stuck after breaking the cutscene, and beating this terrible boss fight against Fluffy again, we enter the endgame. I really like the Devil's Snare fight. It's not hard, but the way these undulating tentacles animate looks really impressive and intimidating. In the chest room, my complaints about the simplicity of the puzzles blow up in my face, considering they made an actually interesting one here and I couldn't figure it out on my own. One of the things that inspired me to make this video was thinking back on these games and remembering how much shared design language there was. I don't know how much contact the teams had with each other. There isn't a lot considering post-mortems of these kind of releases. One of the things that every one of these games seems to do is use the Mirror of Erised as a magical reflecting shield against Voldemort's curses. I don't know where they got that idea from. With that power in hand, Voldemort is defeated, Harry is a murderer, and all is right in the world. One of my favorite things about these games is that even after Dumbledore cheats Gryffindor a million billion last-minute points, it is still very possible to lose the House Cup in this fantastically anticlimactic way. And here we end on Harry as drawn by Tim Buckley. In conclusion, this game blows. The combat is nothing, the puzzles are nothing, the platforming is a mess, and the only thing it has going for it is the simulacra of Hogwarts. It's not worth the effort of trying to get this game to run on modern systems, but if you have an XP rig lying around, you could probably have a good couple hours with this thing. It just falls in line with the litany of other EA-produced shovelware to capitalize on whatever license they were able to get their grubby little mitts on. If the last game was a low-tier attempt at a 3D Zelda game, then this is a low-tier attempt at a 2D one. The combat is awful. Harry's attack windup takes a quarter of a century, and all 4 types of enemies are very fast. If they're on screen, they will usually have enough time to walk over and bite your arm off before Harry can even begin to let out a bit-crunched flipendo at them.
Flipendo!
Seriously, you would think this is a Diablo-like, with the amount of kiting you have to do to survive a basic encounter. Even some fundamental UI things don't feel right in this game. For example, every single item gives you this text prompt every single time you pick it up, because I guess I really needed to know that this particular jelly bean tasted of dirt, even though they all do the exact same shit. With that, I should talk about the spell system in this game. All of them are functionally the same except for Lumos and Flipendo. Every other spell mainly exists as just a way to open a door or hit a switch. You could eliminate at least one of these spells and it would make the game significantly better, considering that changing spells is relegated to a single button and you have to run through all of them in order to get to the spell you want. For this reason, the Lumos sections are all hell, because you have to switch back and forth between whatever spell you need for this particular challenge and the Lumos spell to stop it from going dark every 30 seconds. What makes this worse is the generally poor scripting. Usually it works out fine, you find the switch that opens the door and all is well. Other times, however, reality breaks down. Here, for example, you kill a random snail to get switches to spawn out of nowhere behind you in an area you've probably already explored. In some sections, you can cheerfully ignore all the enemies. In others, you have to kill every single one to proceed. Perhaps the worst of this is how Ron and Hermione are gated from the final battle. Instead of being incapacitated or not being allowed to cross some wicked cool flames, they can't progress because they have to stand on these switches on the chessboard. Wow. Anyway, you kill Voldy by reflecting his spells. Whoops, what a shame about the house cup. I guess I shouldn't have constantly fired spells at every teacher by accident. This game is hot trash and is by far the worst of the Sorcerer's Stone games. Every level is the exact same maze full of the exact same enemies, the combat is clunky and annoying, and the puzzles are either wholly nonsensical or so dull as to just be nothing but a door with a switch. It barely even makes you feel like you're in Hogwarts, which is the only reason you would ever play any of these games. Hopefully the next game will wipe this bad taste out of my mouth. The footage you see here was taken from this long play by the Minotaur because I couldn't get the PlayStation 1 emulator to record good for some reason. I've gotta stop saying for some reason, god damn. Here we start on the same intro as every other one of these games, but this time they bothered to put some effort into it. Instead of just throwing up a couple of JPEGs and calling it a day, they actually mapped it onto a book. Had the book move. That's pretty cool. Gameplay is very similar to the PC game, only with better looking levels and slightly more responsive controls. You're also able to manually aim spells like the bow in Zelda, which makes you kind of feel like you're playing a video game this time. The platforming is made much more tolerable, pretty much entirely because you're controlling it with an analog stick instead of a keyboard. Otherwise, not much has changed. What is different is this game's pacing, which is an absolute mess. Pretty much all adaptations shift things around when compared to the source material, but I have never seen anyone mangle a story worse than this in my entire life. I'll get into more detail about this quirk later, but it is by far the worst thing about this experience. Even if you were to try to take the story on its own merits, it still feels like a random series of events most of the time. Moving on, you might have noticed that this game looks a heck of a lot nicer than the PC version, despite having pretty similar textures and lower resolution models. I think it's the attention to detail in these environments that really makes the difference here. Stuff like these candles floating in the hall goes a long way to making this feel like an actual magical castle. These levels also feel a little more naturalistic in general, with the layout flowing together as an actual building would. There's a lot more to do around the castle as well, which is nice and makes the world feel significantly less empty. You mostly end up finding these mini-games, however, and they do repeat fairly often as the game goes on. Overall, the graphics and levels look charming and are fun to exist in. It's a real shame about the character models, though. Our next stop is over to the Quidditch pitch, and here we find another example of the pacing hurting the experience. Were the Gryffindors about to compete with no Seeker? Because it seems like Harry's only been on the team for roughly 30 minutes and he's already in an official match. On a more positive note, this game does something really interesting here in the way that it gamifies the experience of being Harry Potter. The way that Snape chastises you even if you manage to sing every note on key makes you, the player, feel the unfair treatment he doles out to non-Slytherin students. Let's head over to the common room and talk to the fat lady.
This face!
In the first example of the incompetent story compression, in the final example of the incompetent story compression, before we complete the game, we have one last Quidditch match to suffer through. Why are we letting this child who just nearly got murdered by a professor participate in a fucking wizard blood sport? Moreover, why is this game happening 15 minutes before the semester ends? Overall, this game is leagues better than the PC version, and it's still not all that great. The puzzles are still basically nothing, the character models are an actual goddamn nightmare, and the combat is still awful. Though the platforming is slightly better, a more significant portion of the game focuses on it, and thus it ends up feeling worse than the other games, because you have to engage with it more often. The absolute worst thing, though, is the way the story is structured. The events of this game just don't follow into each other in a way that makes any sense at all. This version of Hogwarts Castle feels good to explore, yes, but even that gets tedious when all you find is beans to unlock the 3 minigames that get repeated ad nauseum. If you have a PS1 and you want a platform action game to play, you have a litany of much more interesting choices at your disposal. In a strange turn of events, the Game Boy Color game is a turn-based RPG. Because of that, this ends up being the best adaptation of the book we're going to cover today. The way you start the game in Diagon Alley and have to find the right stores to buy your school supplies, or the fact that the entire castle is fully explorable and full of tertiary rooms that you never actually have to go into, it honestly makes you feel like you're little Harry Potter running around this fucked up murder castle. There's some editorializing, sure, but a lot of the details are right. RPGs have always had a knack for storytelling in the video game medium, so it makes sense that the only one of these things that wasn't trying to be a Zelda clone would be the most successful adaptation of a book. They even simulate the tedium of not being able to find an empty train car. Yeah, fuck 'em up, Peter, just like you did with those muggles. That's all well and good, but how does it hold up as an actual game? As you can see by now, the graphics are all over the goddamn place. Some of the sprites look nice, others awkward. The animation is mostly serviceable, but occasionally really fantastic. Sometimes the environments look nice, other times... I'm used to seeing this kind of thing from RPG Maker games, or like Hide-Lied, but seeing such a range of attractiveness happen in a single game is very jarring. If there's one consistent thing about the visuals, it's that every single character portrait is completely unacceptable. Huh, Neville, why does this keep happening to you? Moving on from aesthetics, this game is balls hard. This is the first level, and we already have groups of enemies that take at least 5 turns to kill, each. One battle can take you down to near death. There's a bit of strategy to the combat in that different enemies are weak to different spells. In practice, however, this means that when you meet a new enemy, you just have to try every spell on them until you find the right one, which takes just as much time as just brute forcing it with Flipendo unless you get lucky. Anyway, this is a perfect adaptation concerning Hogwarts Castle. The thing is impossible to navigate, is excessively large, chock full of secret passages that I was never able to map out in my brain adequately, and continuously trying to kill all the students. Neville getting blown up in potions class starts off a tedious fetch quest, because that is the only objective you ever get in this game. I don't know how you're expected to find a lot of this shit. Even some of the hints that the students can give you have been nonsensically scattered around and are not even really that helpful. Meanwhile, Harry takes 3 steps outside the castle walls and immediately gets murdered by a gnome. I'm only going to briefly mention the flying in this game because it's the worst and obviously an afterthought. You're moving way too fast horizontally and can barely move vertically. Thus, you will continuously hit all the nonsense bullshit they're throwing at you, making it last at least 1,000,000 times longer than it should. Anyway, after killing a troll by literally giving it a cold, my ROM got corrupted and deleted all my saves. I had to experience the rest of the game by watching this wild speedrun, and I recommend checking it out. Turns out this game's really broken. In conclusion, this is one of the worst non-RPG Maker JRPGs I've ever played. The combat is boring and way too hard, every level is just a shitty maze, and every objective is to run around the entire map, looking for a bunch of random unmarked crap. Still, despite all of that, I found myself enjoying this game. I have a soft spot for RPGs in general, and this one is a close enough adaptation of a book I already like that I was able to stomach some of its lesser qualities. Not that I would want to have to play it legitimately for more than like an hour. I'm glad I stuck with Pokemon as a kid. Remake time, baby! Yes, it seems around a year after the Chamber of Secrets games came out, EA realized that maybe they should try and make up for all this crap they threw out there for the original film release. So they took the same engine and the same map from that game and threw the old story on top of it. Full disclosure before we get any further, I also had to emulate this game because I am not spending this much money on a weird YouTube video that 13 people are going to watch, and this ROM also ended up getting corrupted or something halfway through. So part of this footage is me playing, and the other part is from a long play that you can find in the description if you need to see the entirety of this game for some strange reason. On the bright side, the sound emulation was utterly screwed up and resulted in some very impressive soundscapes.
Nice and fun.
This game looks pretty nice. The cartoon visual style has aged well, and the levels are very detailed. It has a density to the environments that was present in the PS1 version, but without the weird goo rendering of the console. And none of this. The music is excellent as well, being mostly a straight-up orchestral whimsy a la the movie score. There is a popular piece of trivia which posits that the composer, Jeremy Soule, actually wrote the music for the games before hearing the movie scores. I have never found a citation for this, and frankly, it would be a hell of a coincidence if it was true. Then again, it doesn't sound too dissimilar to his work on, say, the Elder Scrolls series, so maybe this is just what happens when you go to a talented classical composer and tell him to make children's wizard music. Now, this is the most apparent Zelda-like of them all. The environment is pretty open to you from the very beginning, with shortcuts and redundant classrooms to jump around in everywhere. 3 years of game design evolution and a slightly less tight deadline does wonders for a game. Huh, EA? This game also does its best to try and differentiate the different spells. I do particularly like how Lumos works in this game. It looks nice, mostly because the lighting engine is so much better, and the way that the secret areas glow when using it is rather appealing. The way that you can equip different spells to the face buttons is a nice touch that we learned about 5 years ago in Ocarina of Time. You get a lot of story compression in this game too, but it feels way more natural than the other non-RPG games. You rarely get those weird moments where it feels like you've missed a lot of time in between opening up a door or whatever. For example, it is a little strange that they entirely skip the dragon/detention subplot and just have Hagrid take Harry into the forest for some potion shit, but at least there's a justification for it. You also only get one Quidditch match this time around, but it actually incorporates Harry's broom getting cursed, so at least that's interesting. It doesn't always work, like how Dumbledore gives his ending speech in the Gryffindor Common Room instead of the Great Hall, but it's leagues better than any of the other 3D games regarding flow and understandability. But with that, we have finally ended our journey through this first wave of Harry Potter video game adaptations. And we ended on a pretty good note. This is the absolute best Sorcerer's Stone game. Sure, hindsight is 2020, and this game came out 2 years after those others without the constraint of needing to be released near the movie, but it's just so much better in basically every aspect. The graphics are better, both stylistically and render quality-wise. The spells are more diverse, the levels are more interestingly designed, it even excels atmospherically in a lot of areas. If you were just absolutely itching to play a video game based off the first Harry Potter book, I would recommend this over any other. So, overall, how is the Sorcerer's Stone brand? It's okay. The book provides a good starting ground, but it is indeed not what I would call exceptional, even for this series. The film is similar in that regard, although I think they vary wildly between each other. The games, however, are kind of a disaster. No offense toward the devs of any of these games, of course, they were working within such enormous constraints and had to make such wildly varied games for extremely different hardware. I can't blame them for having some missteps. As it stands, they are artifacts of a very different time, where greedy companies couldn't just push their shovelware adaptations out on mobile and call it a day. And frankly, I think we have it a lot better these days. Sorcerers. Fuck.